obviously, we've had a change in government recently. We've got a new leader in the opposition, so I think we all may have our own views about what may be happening over the next few years in terms of what politics will be doing. So what are the drivers for developing high quality and lower carbon, low energy homes in the next 5 to 10 years? We've done some research, and that's what I'm going to go through today. So, what do people want? I think one of the important things today is actually, it's not buildings that use energy on their own, as Lord Redstone was saying. It's the cleaners, when they're switching the lights on, is using the energy. It's not the buildings themselves. So actually, what are people doing about all of this? And what actually influences people, how they use the building? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our home quality mark, our new standard that replaces the Coast Vale homes, and the next steps of how we're going to get that into market. So, what do consumers want? If we start talking to consumers about nearly zero energy buildings or dynamic simulation modelling, pretty sure most people on the street would probably turn off and want to go to the pub as soon as possible. However, people do want homes which are comfortable to live in. They do want the cosy, they do want the warmth, they don't want their home to be overheating, they don't want their home to have bad air quality. And so all of those things lead to those outcomes. So we've always got to be thinking about what those outcomes are and thinking about the language that we communicate to these things. So there's lots of different things coming out for the rest of the day, and I think I just urge you to think about what that particular element means to the people that are going to be using and living in the building. So we've done 3 pieces of consumer research in the development of home quality mark. Firstly, with Money Supermarket, a number of surveys. We've done some independent focus groups and some general surveys of people who are living in high-performing homes. The general outcome is that people choose what home they live in mainly due to heart reasons. They choose the home from their heart. They fall in love with the place before they start to think about it. However, everybody recognises there's some critical information which actually helps to make that information and make that choice much more to fit their pocket, to fit their health, to fit their life circumstances. We also need to always bear in mind that there's many people in the country who actually having a house and actually having a home at any kind of level is a real challenge. So there's always that level as well that we need to be bearing in mind there. So if we go into a little bit more detail about what that consumer research came out, what are the key kind of important things that people are talking about? There's probably some things on here which are not particularly surprising. So amenities, location, and space are kind of 3 key areas that everybody talks about. But, you know, location is not the number one, not the only thing that people think about. Because if location was the only thing, everybody would be living in central London. It's that amazing. But people live all over the place. People have lots of other different reasons about why they live in particular places. But there's these other areas which is quite untangible. It's very difficult to quantify. So the whole idea of quality, what actually is that? What makes that up? There's many things which I think we'll go into today, but that whole sense of community always leads to that. But then there's the financial side of things as well. So people do buy a home if you're looking to buy a home, and also if you're an investor, the financial side of things always need to add up. And actually, if we're investing in housing that isn't of high quality, that is going to fall down, or if it's not going to fit for the changing future in terms of our climate, in terms of resilience, but then also if it's not going to fit in terms of what the energy costs are, and it's going to lead to people in fuel poverty. Obviously, many social housing sector is very important about that. And interestingly, the one fundamental kind of technical issue that everybody was talking about was noise. And people just don't want to hear their neighbours. People don't want to hear what's going on outside and so on and so forth. So noise is a real issue that is actually still the biggest complaint to local authorities. So as well as everything else, we always need to bear in mind that noise is still very important. But do people want something extra? Do people actually care about what's going on in the world? Well, in the Money Supermarket research we did, actually 96% of people had already made changes to their life to be more sustainable. People knew that they had to do something, they were trying to do something, they were trying to make a difference, whether that's recycling, whether that's maybe driving a car which was more efficient, or changing their behaviour in terms of how they dealt with energy. But then there's also issues around the daylight and the air quality within the building, which people are really very interested in. And that is something that is really changing over time, particularly at higher end developments. But people, when they're asked about what they thought about new developments, people are often surprised. They often had a pretty low expectation of what new build would give them. And often their expectations were well exceeded. And I think that's a message that we actually need to start getting out a lot more, that actually new builds and high quality retrofits, actually it's not just about the energy, it's everything else, how it can influence people's health and well-being, how it can improve the way that you live, actually can really help people. And then that will start to drive the change and become more acceptable, is something that's really very important. And as I mentioned, that whole reassurance around running costs. People don't want high running costs in the future. And energy is a part of that, but we also mustn't forget things like maintenance and management costs. I know in London that there's some developments where you may have low energy and low carbon buildings, and actually many of the energy bills are very small, but the maintenance for some of the systems which are achieving that are actually really quite high, and potentially higher than the energy bills themselves. And we need to ensure that we don't move into a space where people's energy bills are becoming very small, but the maintenance is becoming, and the management is becoming very large. So, and then we moved on to asking people about the whole idea of an independent mark. Housing is something that's fundamentally different to every other product that's out there. So if you're looking to buy a car, a mobile phone, insurance, all those kind of consumer products, you have more choice because these products move. A house doesn't move, it's always in a single location unless you're looking at a holiday home or something like that. And so the idea that the problem that people has is trust. They don't trust estate agents. They don't necessarily trust their solicitor unless they've had a good experience. They don't usually trust developers either. And so trust is a real problem. At the moment, it's obviously quite easy for developers to be building homes and selling them. One developer said to me the other day, can basically put anything up and sell it at any price. But if we actually really want to change the market, we actually need to change that trust element, and that's what will help deliver more homes. So people want that independence mark, to be able to give them some pointers, some information, some independent advice about what they can really be looking at. The whole idea of adding some value, how are we going to do that? Well, there's a number of spaces. There's obviously the health and well-being space, which is a key area, but then also on the financial side of things, when we start actually getting more robustness around our calculations in terms of running costs and energy and maintenance, actually that's when we start to influence mortgages and so on and so forth, which I'll go into a little bit in more detail in a moment. So when we ask people, would they actually want a home with an independent mark, 54% of people said that they would prefer it. But interestingly, 43% said they'd always prefer to have an independent mark around a home, because that product of a home is different to other products like mobile phones and cars. That independence is so much more important. And then would people pay extra for some sort of independent mark? 1 in 5 people would pay more, which is actually quite a high amount, really. So how does Home Quality Mark address all of this? So there's lots and lots of different issues. Many of the things that we're going to go into today, you can't think about one thing on its own at any one time. I think that may have been the problem in the past, that actually we probably thought too much just about carbon and CO2 emissions, and we had issues where we may have focused very much on the CO2 emissions. It meant that affordability became a problem. It meant that we had systems which actually, if you have people living in them who aren't living exactly like the calculation methodology was thinking that they should do, then you don't get the right energy costs around that. But people, we have to think about what people want as well. So things like air quality, daylight, temperature, aftercare, all of that kind of stuff becomes more and more important. And obviously, the more that we start to drive down CO2 emissions from new buildings, we actually need to become more and more aware of the embodied impact of those materials that are used to build a building, because they become more and more important over time. So how we calculate that and how we ensure that those materials are the best materials in terms of their durability and resilience, but also of low CO2 as well. So what we aim for the Home Quality Mark is it becomes a label, a scheme, a scorecard that is as recognisable as all of these logos up here at the moment. So stuff like MSC in terms of sustainable fish, and the Euro NCAP in terms of safety in cars, but then also the areas of like Trivago and TripAdvisor, where actually people can start to have a little bit more of a say about how their home is performing. There's some really good news stories about new housing out there. Why don't actually we start to put that across to people and show what is good, so that actually people can really see the difference between good and bad housing? So why have we chosen Home Quality Mark? Why aren't we calling it Code for Sustainable Homes version 2 or BREEAM Housing or any of those kind of names? So this is very much about what I was saying very at the beginning, that we need to communicate all of these technical things that we're talking about in a new language. Sustainability doesn't really work. Carbon doesn't really work. People who are interested in those terms are interested in it. But actually, the man on the street, the person on the street, doesn't really care so much about that as we all probably do. So we need to use language and terminology that works for everybody. Home rather than house. It's about the people inside it. Quality, everybody wants that quality, but they don't actually know really how to measure it. So actually giving some sort of measurement around quality is very important. And that whole idea of the independence, the reassurance around a mark as well. And developers are very keen in ensuring that we actually have that independent benchmarking. Because the key reasons why we need the Home Quality Mark is not only to give consumers that the tools to enable them to make a smart choice, but also allowing developers to actually differentiate their product. Since probably this time last year, I've just been going around talking to developers and talking about their businesses and how they go about doing things. And everybody does things in completely different ways. They all have their unique selling points. They all want to differentiate themselves. And yes, they want to differentiate themselves to consumers, but they also want to differentiate themselves to planners. They also want to differentiate themselves to clients, whether that's social clients or investors or a number of other clients that could be. So that differentiation and really going above and beyond is something that people really want to put across, and really articulating the benefits of new homes. So this is our timeline, where we've been and where we're going. So obviously we had the Housing Standards Review last year in the dim and distant past. I used to have a zero carbon homes thing on 2016, but obviously that's no longer. In 2017, we have the cost optimal review, which I don't actually have on that, but that's about seeing whether or not we're going to be achieving the European regulations at the most cost optimal way, which actually might be what we're doing in Part L 2013. Which is interesting because it means that energy and carbon become very more important in Home Quality Mark. So we launched the themes and the names and the branding Build earlier this year. We've been working on a number of study sites. So yesterday I was up in a factory in Hull where they were building 33 units in a factory, which is going to be taken to a site in Liverpool, social housing, and they've been working on the site during that same period as us and doing all the groundworks, doing all the driveways and all that kind of stuff, and the houses are literally just going to get plonked on there. And actually it's very interesting to see how high quality building homes in a factory can be. So we're learning from these study sites, we're developing the technical developments. We've just had a consultation which has closed at the end of the week before last, and we're taking that all into account and will become operational at the end of October. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that is in a moment. So how do we start to articulate, how do we start to communicate these good outcomes from high quality housing? And at the moment in time, Home Quality Mark is for new build, but as has already been said, the rest of the housing market is the real big challenge. And we need to think about ways in which this can also relate to the rest of the house building sector as well. So the idea of a overall star rating is probably quite familiar. It's probably quite familiar to consumers. You see it on Amazon, you see it on hotels, you see it on all sorts of different areas about what is good. Fundamentally different to the code, because a code level 6 home was about crystal balling and looking into the future. That was government looking into the future. Whereas 5-star and Home Quality Mark is an outstanding home at this particular moment in time. Beneath that we have the 3 pillars of sustainability. So that cost one, a well-being one, and also the environmental footprint. Obviously the cost, these become the drivers for the scheme. So cost is obviously very important to the financial sector. So we're doing work in terms of seeing how Home Quality Mark can give more reassurance to the mortgage sector and also the financial sector in terms of financing for developers. So if you're building to higher standards, there's a number of outcomes for that. So currently mortgage companies, they just look at government stats in terms of energy bills, and it doesn't matter whether you're looking to buy a Victorian mansion of leaky floors and leaky windows with 2-3 grand energy bills, the way that or a brand new build which has got perhaps bills of £200, the mortgage companies will look at them the same and just take an average. So that's obviously a huge difference in terms of what your monthly outgoings could be. And actually we're trying to put pressure on the mortgage companies to start recognising that there is good data, there is examples of actual low energy use in new housing. So providing more reassurance for the mortgage companies to be able to start doing that. Obviously, within that, we also shouldn't just think about the energy bills, as I previously mentioned. It's about the maintenance, the durability, and everything else as well. The well-being also becomes a driver. That's something that people are becoming more and more interested. They actually care about their health. They care about what happens with their children. There's increasing air quality concerns in towns and cities, and actually people want to ensure that that's not impacting their children as much as possible. But doing this all with a low environmental footprint. Our research showed that nearly 100% of people are trying to do something to help reduce their impact on the planet. So it is important to people, but we don't communicate it to people in a particularly great way at the moment. So this is what we think is the best way. And we do this in a way that the data can be used by people in all sorts of different ways. So the data becomes open, and driving that data and using it for the financial sector, or whether it's for the NHS or everybody else, then that actually really starts to drive the higher performing, high standard homes. So how we're structuring the home quality mark, we're splitting it into two different ways, because my first slide, my comments about SAP and BIM and everything else, that people aren't particularly interested in those technical input side of things, but they are interested in the outcomes of those. So we need to separate the two in some sort of way. So we have 3 sections down the side, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, and the outputs in terms of the star rating and the different indicators are the things that people really will start to make decisions upon. So this is the kind of things that we're looking at. So our surroundings, that's the community-based type things. There's no point building what looks to be a very sustainable home if the location and the way of life doesn't really work. So actually the context of the home is really important. And also, like, the resilience to climate change, flooding, that kind of stuff is still really key, because you can build a very energy efficient home, but if it floods next day, then it's pretty pointless. So in terms of my home, things like energy, as I already mentioned, but we mustn't build homes which are only energy efficient. They must also have good quality of air within inside them. They must be able to hold their temperature at the right temperature, not get too hot, not get too cold. We need to start thinking about the embodied impact of those materials much more than we currently are. And it all needs to be done in a way that has the correct space for people to live in, but then is also accessible for all to be able to use as well, when people get to older age or with children or so on and so forth. The final area, I think, is probably the most interesting area, the knowledge sharing. So this is about reducing the performance gap effectively. When you buy a car, when you buy a mobile phone, it usually works. If it doesn't work, you take it back and you probably get another one. Maybe not with a car, with a mobile phone you probably would. But housing, it seems to be accepted that you're going to have a problem with your house. It's going to have cracks, it's going to have so on and so forth. But there are good practices out there where developers really are actually caring about their customers and communicating with them after they've finished. Particularly when we get to rental and investors, so the investors are having a much longer term relationship. So we're looking at encouraging that longer term relationship and improving that communication from the people who design the property, the people who build it, the people who market it, to get these messages across to the people who live and occupy and maintain. That whole communication loop right across is really important. And there's so many tools that can help with that, and whether it's BIM or everything else, to actually ensure that we always have that common thread all the way along. But it's really important to ensure that homes are actually meeting and exceeding people's expectations. So next steps. So technical consultation in terms of home quality mark is just closed. We've had a wide and varied response to it, which particularly pleased that over the summer. We held it over the summer, and also just because we know that industry is particularly busy at the moment. So we're pleased that we're still getting lots of engagement from various different places. Probably the key theme of the responses was that we need to ensure that the inputs are as simple and rational as possible, not to make it too complicated. I think my next really big area of work is about developing the links with the financial bodies, ensuring that we really do get those key drivers into the scheme. And along with developing software and the data. So we're going to have a go-live version at the end of October. It's probably going to be a beta version so that people can test it as much as possible, and it will probably lead to an update in the following year. But we really do think that outside of government, there are real drivers for high-quality, more sustainable homes. Thank you for listening, and I think we're probably going to have some questions now. And can always find some more information there as well.
So, ladies and gents, I think we'll have a round of applause.